Wedding photographer's affair with bride exposed in deadly wedding day. Callum Thorne and Evelyn Russo were the epitome of young love. Both 20 years old, they seemed destined for each other from the moment they met. Callum, with his boyish charm and ambitious spirit, had just started his own landscaping business. His rugged good looks and kind heart made him popular among the locals, but he had eyes for only one person. Evelyn, on the other hand, was a vision of grace and beauty. With flowing hair and piercing eyes, she turned heads wherever she went. A talented artist, she dreamed of opening her own gallery one day. Her creativity and passion for life were infectious, drawing people to her like moths to a flame. Their paths crossed on a crisp autumn evening at the annual Millbrook Harvest Festival. Callum was volunteering at the pumpkin carving station, his strong hands skillfully guiding children as they created their masterpieces. Evelyn, manning the face painting booth, couldn't help but notice the gentle giant with the infectious laugh. As fate would have it, they found themselves cleaning up side by side as the festival wound down. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by shy glances and nervous laughter. By the end of the night, they had exchanged numbers and made plans to meet for coffee the following week. From that moment on, Callum and Evelyn were inseparable. Their relationship blossomed at a dizzying pace, fueled by the intensity of young love and the excitement of finding a kindred spirit. They spent their days exploring the hidden gems of Millbrook, from secluded hiking trails to quaint cafes tucked away in corners of the town. Evenings were filled with long conversations about their hopes and dreams. Callum spoke passionately about expanding his business, while Evelyn shared her sketches and paintings, her eyes lighting up as she described the emotions behind each piece. They supported each other's ambitions wholeheartedly, each believing they had found their perfect match. Their families and friends marveled at the strength of their connection. It was as if they had known each other for years rather than months. Evelyn's parents, Thomas and Maria Russo, welcomed Callum with open arms, seeing in him the son they never had. Callum's widowed mother, Fiona Thorne, was equally enamored with Evelyn, grateful that her son had found someone who brought such joy to his life. As winter turned to spring, their love only grew stronger. They began making plans for the future, talking about where they might live, how many children they wanted, and the adventures they would embark on together. It seemed that nothing could dampen their enthusiasm for the life they were building. On a warm evening in May, just 6 months after they had met, Callum got down on one knee in the very spot where they had first talked at the Harvest Festival. With tears in his eyes, he asked Evelyn to be his wife. Without hesitation, she said yes, sealing their commitment with a kiss that held the promise of forever. Little did they know that their fairy tale was about to take a dark turn, one that would test the very foundations of their love and trust in ways they could never have imagined. The news of Callum and Evelyn's engagement spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The town buzzed with excitement, eager to celebrate the union of two of its most beloved young residents. The couple wasted no time diving headfirst into wedding planning, their enthusiasm palpable as they discussed every detail of their special day. Evelyn threw herself into the preparations with gusto. She spent hours poring over bridal magazines, creating mood boards, and visiting venues. Her artistic eye came in handy as she meticulously coordinated color schemes and floral arrangements. Callum, while less interested in the finer details, was happy to support Evelyn's vision, offering input when asked and ensuring that his bride-to-be had everything she desired. As the weeks passed, however, subtle changes began to creep into their relationship. Evelyn, once so open and affectionate, started to become distant and preoccupied. She would spend long hours on her phone, quickly locking the screen whenever Callum entered the room. Her explanations of wedding-related calls and messages rang hollow, leaving Callum with a nagging sense of unease. Their once frequent date nights became increasingly rare, with Evelyn citing wedding stress and the need to finalize details as reasons for canceling plans. When they did spend time together, she seemed distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. Callum tried to brush off his concerns, attributing her behavior to pre-wedding jitters and the pressure of planning such a significant event. Friends and family noticed the shift as well. Evelyn's best friend Zoe remarked on how Evelyn no longer gushed about Callum the way she used to. Callum's mother, Fiona, sensed a tension between the couple that hadn't been there before. She gently probed her son, asking if everything was all right. But Callum brushed off her concerns with a forced smile and reassurances that all was well. As the wedding day drew nearer, Callum's doubts grew stronger. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Late one night, as Evelyn slept soundly beside him, he found himself staring at the ceiling, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He loved Evelyn with all his heart, but a voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps she no longer felt the same way. Little did Callum know that his instincts were right on the mark. The woman lying next to him, the one he had chosen to spend his life with, was harboring a secret that would soon shatter their world and set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. As Callum grappled with his growing doubts, a new figure entered the scene, one who would play a pivotal role in the unfolding drama. Garrett Blackwood, a renowned wedding photographer, came highly recommended by several of Millbrook's elite families. At 50 years old, Garrett exuded a magnetic charm that belied his age. His salt and pepper hair and piercing eyes gave him a distinguished appearance, while his quick wit and smooth demeanor made him instantly likable. Garrett had made a name for himself capturing the most intimate moments of couples' special days. His portfolio was impressive, featuring stunning shots that seemed to capture not just images but emotions. When Evelyn stumbled upon his work online, she was immediately captivated. She convinced Callum that Garrett was the only choice for their wedding photographer, insisting that his artistic vision aligned perfectly with her own. Their first meeting with Garrett took place at a trendy cafe in downtown Millbrook. From the moment he walked in, his presence commanded attention. He greeted the couple with a warm smile and a firm handshake, his eyes lingering on Evelyn a fraction longer than necessary. As they discussed the wedding plans, Garrett's focus seemed to be primarily on the bride-to-be, hanging on her every word and offering enthusiastic praise for her ideas. Callum, initially impressed by Garrett's portfolio and professionalism, found himself feeling increasingly uncomfortable as the meeting progressed. He couldn't quite put his finger on why, but something about the way Garrett interacted with Evelyn set him on edge. He brushed it off as artistic camaraderie, trying to convince himself that he was reading too much into innocent interactions. As they left the cafe, Evelyn couldn't stop talking about how perfect Garrett was for their wedding. She gushed about his vision, his talent, and how lucky they were to have secured his services. Callum nodded along, pushing down the twinge of jealousy that threatened to surface. In the weeks that followed, Garrett became a frequent presence in their lives. He insisted on multiple meetings to discuss shot lists, lighting, and locations. Each time, Evelyn seemed to grow more animated and excited about the photography aspect of the wedding. She began to suggest additional photo sessions, including an engagement shoot and a boudoir session as a surprise for Callum. Garrett's charm extended beyond the couple. At a pre-wedding dinner with both families, he regaled everyone with tales of his travels and the celebrities he had photographed. Evelyn's parents were particularly taken with him, praising his sophistication and worldliness. Even Callum's mother, Fiona, found herself warming to Garrett's charismatic personality. As the wedding day approached, Garrett's influence on the proceedings grew. He suggested changes to the venue layout to optimize lighting, advised on the timing of events to capture the best moments, and even offered input on Evelyn's choice of dress. With each suggestion, Evelyn became more enthralled, while Callum felt increasingly sidelined in his own wedding plans. Little did anyone know that behind Garrett's professional facade and charming smile lurked a man with his own agenda, one that would soon threaten to destroy not just a wedding, but lives. The spark that ignited the affair between Evelyn and Garrett was as unexpected as it was intense. It happened during a routine meeting to discuss the wedding photo locations. Callum, tied up with an emergency at work, couldn't make it, leaving Evelyn to meet Garrett alone at a picturesque spot by Millbrook Lake. As they walked along the shore, scouting for the perfect backdrop, their conversation drifted from wedding plans to more personal topics. Garrett, with his worldly experience and smooth talking, captivated Evelyn. He spoke of his travels, the art he had seen, and the life he had lived, all things that resonated deeply with Evelyn's artistic soul and her dreams of a life beyond Millbrook. In a moment of vulnerability, Evelyn confessed her fears about settling down so young, her doubts about whether she was truly ready for marriage. Garrett listened intently, offering understanding and empathy. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, Garrett gently tucked a strand of hair behind Evelyn's ear. The touch, innocent as it seemed, sent a jolt of electricity through both of them. Their eyes met, and in that instant, a line was crossed. The kiss that followed was passionate and forbidden, awakening feelings in Evelyn that she had never experienced before. When they finally broke apart, breathless and guilty, they knew that everything had changed. The affair escalated quickly from there. Evelyn and Garrett began meeting in secret, using the pretense of wedding preparations to steal moments alone. They would rendezvous at out-of-town cafes, secluded spots in the nearby forest, and even in Garrett's studio under the guise of planning the boudoir shoot. Each encounter left Evelyn feeling more alive and conflicted. The depth passion she felt with Garrett was intoxicating, unlike anything she had experienced with Callum. Garrett made her feel sophisticated, understood, and desired in a way that thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. For Garrett, Evelyn represented a chance to recapture his youth. Her beauty, innocence, and enthusiasm reminded him of the women he had loved and lost in his younger days. He knew the affair was wrong, that he was potentially destroying a young couple's future, but he couldn't bring himself to end it. As the affair deepened, Evelyn found herself pulling away from Callum. She made excuses to avoid intimacy, claiming stress and exhaustion from wedding planning. When they were together, her mind was often elsewhere, replaying moments with Garrett or planning their next clandestine meeting. Callum, sensing the growing distance between them, tried desperately to reconnect. He planned surprise dates, wrote her love notes, and even suggested they take a break from wedding planning to focus on their relationship. But Evelyn, consumed by her secret passion, found herself unable to reciprocate his efforts fully. The guilt ate away at Evelyn. There were moments when she considered confessing everything to Callum, moments when she resolved to end things with Garrett. But each time she saw Garrett, all her resolve crumbled. The thrill of their forbidden romance was too strong to resist. As the wedding day drew nearer, the stakes grew higher. Evelyn knew she had to make a decision, but found herself paralyzed by indecision. She loved Callum, or at least she thought she did, but the passion she felt for Garrett was undeniable. The idea of walking down the aisle to Callum while harboring these secrets filled her with dread. Garrett, for his part, began to pressure Evelyn to call off the wedding. He painted pictures of the life they could have together, traveling the world, pursuing their artistic passions, living a life free from the constraints of small-town expectations. His words were a siren song to Evelyn, tempting her with a future that seemed both thrilling and terrifying. As the days ticked down to the wedding, the tension mounted. Evelyn knew that soon she would have to face the consequences of her actions. Little did she know that fate and Callum had other plans. As Evelyn became more deeply entangled in her affair with Garrett, Callum's initial doubts blossomed into full-fledged suspicion. The changes in Evelyn were too significant to ignore. Her emotional distance, her constant preoccupation with her phone, and the way she seemed to light up whenever Garrett's name was mentioned. Determined to understand what was happening, Callum tried to communicate with Evelyn. He initiated conversations about their relationship, asking if she was having second thoughts about the wedding. Evelyn's responses were always the same, reassurances that she was just stressed about the wedding preparations and that everything was fine. But her words rang hollow, lacking the sincerity and warmth that had once characterized their interactions. Unsatisfied with Evelyn's explanations, Callum began to pay closer attention to her behavior. He noticed how she would abruptly end phone calls when he entered the room, the way her eyes would dart nervously when asked about her whereabouts, and the increasing frequency of her meetings with Garrett. One evening, as they lay in bed, Callum reached out to hold Evelyn, only to have her flinch away from his touch. The pain of that reflexive rejection was a turning point for Callum. He knew then that he couldn't ignore his instincts any longer. Reluctantly, Callum began to gather evidence. He felt ashamed of his actions, but the need to know the truth overrode his guilt. He started by checking Evelyn's phone records, noting the frequent calls and texts to a number he didn't recognize. He drove by Garrett's studio at odd hours, his heart sinking when he saw Evelyn's car parked outside, long after their scheduled meeting should have ended. The final piece of evidence came in the form of a forgotten receipt. While doing laundry, Callum found a crumpled paper in Evelyn's jacket pocket, a bill from a hotel in the next town over. The date coincided with a day Evelyn had claimed to be visiting her cousin. As the reality of Evelyn's betrayal sank in, Callum was overwhelmed with a mixture of anger, hurt, and disbelief. The woman he loved, the one he had planned to spend his life with, had been lying to him for months. The future he had envisioned, their home, their family, their shared dreams, seemed to crumble before his eyes. Torn between confronting Evelyn and gathering more evidence, Callum found himself at a crossroads. Should he call off the wedding based on his suspicions, confront Evelyn and demand the truth, or wait and see if she would come clean on her own? As the wedding day loomed ever closer, Callum knew he had to make a decision. Little did he know that the choice he would make would set in motion a series of events that would change everyone's lives forever. The night before the wedding, Callum found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with doubts and suspicions. As dawn broke, he made a fateful decision. He needed to know the truth once and for all. With shaking hands, he picked up Evelyn's phone from the nightstand. She had always guarded it closely, but in her exhausted state the night before, she had forgotten to set the passcode. Guilt gnawed at him as he opened her messages, but the need for answers overpowered his moral hesitation. What he found shattered his world. Messages between Evelyn and Garrett filled the screen, leaving no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Intimate photos, declarations of love, and plans for their future together after the wedding was called off. It was all there in black and white. Callum's hands trembled as he scrolled through months of deception. He read about secret rendezvous, passionate encounters, and worst of all, Evelyn's doubts about marrying him. In one particularly painful exchange, Evelyn had written to Garrett, "I love you in a way I never loved Callum. You make me feel alive." As the full extent of the betrayal sank in, Callum felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it before he emptied the contents of his stomach. The sound of his retching woke Evelyn, who called out to him in concern. Gathering himself, Callum returned to the bedroom. Evelyn sat up in bed, her face etched with worry as she took in his pale complexion and red-rimmed eyes. She asked what was wrong, reaching out to touch his arm. Callum recoiled from her touch as if burned. In that moment, looking at the woman he had loved and trusted, Callum felt a surge of anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. He held up her phone, his voice low and dangerous as he asked, "How long?" Evelyn's face drained of color as she realized what had happened. She started to speak, to offer explanations and excuses, but Callum cut her off. He didn't want to hear it. The evidence was irrefutable. As the reality of the situation sank in, Evelyn broke down in tears, begging Callum to understand, to forgive her. She claimed she had been confused, that she still loved him, but her words fell on deaf ears. Callum's mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the guests who would soon be arriving, the families who had traveled for the wedding, the life they had planned together, all of it built on a foundation of lies. In that moment, something shifted in Callum. The hurt and betrayal crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. He looked at Evelyn, the woman he had thought would be his wife, and made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. "The wedding will go on," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "but not the way you think." With those cryptic words, Callum left the room, leaving a stunned and tearful Evelyn behind. As he closed the door, he knew that the events he was about to set in motion would have consequences beyond anything he could imagine. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil brewing beneath the surface. The Millbrook Community Church, a picturesque white building with a tall steeple, was adorned with flowers and ribbons. Guests began to arrive, dressed in their finest, unaware of the drama unfolding behind the scenes. In the groom's room, Callum sat alone, staring at his reflection in the mirror. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night, but his face was set in grim determination. His best man, Liam, entered the room, ready with jokes to calm pre-wedding jitters. He faltered when he saw Callum's expression, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Callum brushed off Liam's concerns, insisting that everything was fine. But as he mechanically went through the motions of getting ready, his mind was racing, replaying the shocking discoveries of the previous night and finalizing the plan he had formulated in the dark hours of the morning. Meanwhile, in the bridal suite, Evelyn was a bundle of nerves. Her bridesmaids fluttered around her, adjusting her gown and veil, oblivious to the real reason for her distress. Evelyn's eyes were red and puffy, which everyone attributed to emotional anticipation of the big day. Only she knew the truth, that her tears were born of guilt, fear, and confusion. As she was helped into her wedding dress, Evelyn's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Garrett, wishing her luck and expressing his love. The message only intensified her inner turmoil. She had spent the night torn between her feelings for Garrett and her commitment to Callum, unsure of how to proceed. Outside, guests continued to arrive. Callum's mother, Fiona, greeted people with a strained smile, unable to shake off the feeling that something was amiss with her son. Evelyn's parents, Thomas and Maria, beamed with pride, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. Garrett arrived, camera in hand, ready to capture the day's events. His professional demeanor was in place, but those who looked closely might have noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes darted around nervously. As the ceremony start time approached, a palpable tension began to build. The wedding planner, sensing that something was off, tried to coordinate with both bride and groom, but found herself stonewalled at every turn. Guests took their seats in the church, an excited murmur filling the air. The organist began to play, signaling the start of the ceremony. Callum stood at the altar, his face an unreadable mask. The groomsmen exchanged worried glances, picking up on his unusual demeanor. The bridesmaids began their procession down the aisle, each step bringing the moment of truth closer. As the bridal march began to play, all eyes turned to the back of the church, expecting to see a radiant Evelyn. But Evelyn hesitated at the church doors, her father at her side. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that once she took that first step down the aisle, there would be no turning back. Her father, mistaking her reluctance for normal nerves, gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. With a deep breath, Evelyn began her walk down the aisle. Each step felt like an eternity. As she approached Callum, their eyes met, and in that moment she knew that he knew everything. The look in his eyes, a mixture of hurt, anger, and something else she couldn't quite identify, sent a chill down her spine. As Evelyn reached the altar and took her place beside Callum, the officiant began to speak. But before he could get more than a few words out, Callum raised his hand, silencing him. A hush fell over the church as all eyes turned to the groom, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence in the church was deafening as Callum turned to face the assembled guests. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried to every corner of the building. "Friends, family, I want to thank you all for coming today," he began, his words measured and deliberate. "You're here to witness a union, a commitment of love and trust. But before we proceed, there's something you all need to know." Evelyn, standing beside him, felt her heart racing. She reached out to touch Callum's arm to stop him, but he shrugged off her hand without even looking at her. "For the past few months," Callum continued, his voice gaining strength, "the woman I thought I would spend my life with has been living a lie. She's been having an affair." A collective gasp rippled through the church. Evelyn's parents, seated in the front row, looked on in shock and disbelief. Fiona Thorne covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. "And not just with anyone," Callum went on, his gaze sweeping the crowd until it landed on Garrett, who stood frozen near the back of the church, camera forgotten in his hands. "With our wedding photographer, Garrett Blackwood." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Guests turned in their seats, craning their necks to look at Garrett. Murmurs of shock and disgust filled the air. Evelyn's mother let out a strangled cry, while her father's face turned an alarming shade of red. Evelyn, her face ashen, tried to speak, but no words came out. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked frantically between Callum and the stunned congregation. Garrett, for his part, seemed to shrink under the collective gaze of the wedding guests. He took a step back as if contemplating fleeing, but found his exit blocked by outraged attendees. "I discovered their betrayal last night," Callum continued, his voice now trembling with emotion. Months of lies, of sneaking around behind my back, and I decided that rather than call off the wedding, I would give them exactly what they deserve: exposure. With these words, Callum reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of papers, printouts of messages and photos he had discovered on Evelyn's phone. He began to read aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the shocked silence of the church, laying bare every sordid detail of the affair. As Callum's revelations continued, the atmosphere in the church shifted from shock to anger. The day that was meant to celebrate love had turned into a public humiliation, and the tension in the air was palpable, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. As Callum's words hung in the air, the church erupted into chaos. Shouts of anger and disbelief filled the sacred space, drowning out the sobs of Evelyn and the protestations of Garrett. Evelyn's father, Thomas Russo, was the first to act. He lunged toward Garrett, his face contorted with rage. "You bastard!" he roared, his fist connecting with Garrett's jaw in a sickening crunch. Garrett stumbled backward, crashing into a row of pews. The violent outburst seemed to break a dam, and suddenly the church was a sea of motion. Guests surged forward, some trying to restrain Thomas, others joining in his attack on Garrett. Women screamed, children cried, and the air was thick with the sound of shattering glass as vases and decorations were knocked over in the melee. Evelyn, still at the altar, collapsed to her knees, her pristine white dress pooling around her. She reached out toward Callum, begging him to stop, to take it all back. But Callum stood impassive, watching the chaos unfold with a detached expression. In the midst of the pandemonium, Garrett managed to break free from his attackers. Bloodied and disoriented, he stumbled toward the exit. Evelyn, seeing him trying to escape, suddenly found her feet. In a moment of panic and desperation, she hitched up her dress and ran after him, pushing past shocked guests. Callum, seeing Evelyn flee, felt something snap inside him. The cold detachment that had sustained him through his revelation gave way to a white-hot rage. Without thinking, he took off in pursuit, shouldering past his best man, who tried to hold him back. Outside the church, the bright sunlight was jarring after the dim interior. Garrett had made it to his car and was fumbling with his keys when Evelyn caught up to him. She grabbed his arm, pleading with him, though for what she wasn't sure, to take her with him, to stay and face the consequences. Before Garrett could respond, Callum burst out of the church. The sight of Evelyn with Garrett, still in her wedding dress, was the final straw. With a roar of anguish and fury, Callum charged toward them. What happened next occurred so quickly that later witnesses would give conflicting accounts. There was a scuffle, shouts, and then the sharp retort of a gunshot that cut through the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, everything went still. Then Evelyn screamed, a sound of pure horror that would haunt those who heard it for years to come. As she crumpled to the ground, cradling Callum's motionless body, the full tragedy of the day became horrifyingly clear. The gunshot that rang out in front of Millbrook Community Church marked the violent end of what should have been a day of celebration. As the echo faded, it left in its wake a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Callum Thorne lay motionless on the ground, blood seeping through his crisp white shirt, staining it a deep crimson. Evelyn knelt beside him, her wedding dress now smeared with dirt and blood, her anguished cries piercing the air. Garrett Blackwood stood frozen, the smoking gun still in his hand, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Within minutes, the quiet street was filled with the wail of sirens as police and paramedics rushed to the scene. Despite their best efforts, Callum was pronounced dead at the scene, the bullet having struck him directly in the heart. Garrett offered no resistance as he was handcuffed and led away, his eyes vacant, still struggling to comprehend what he had done. Evelyn, in a state of hysteria, had to be sedated before she could be moved from Callum's side. Garrett Blackwood was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Evelyn Russo, though not charged with any crime, faced the harsh judgment of the community and her own conscience. She eventually left Millbrook, unable to bear the weight of the memories and the accusing glances of her neighbors.